Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. We welcome all of you who are here today. We'd also like to welcome everyone who is watching on live stream at santamariatimes.com. You are able to submit questions at any time prior to an intermission by going to Twitter and tweet at Santa Maria Times to submit your questions. And again, you can do that anytime before we go to admission. What I would like to do is introduce our panelists who have been very kind and generous in agreeing to participate today. Chad Kelly is not a panelist, but he is here in the audience and is being replaced by Kate Adams. Kate Adams is a professor of English here at Allen Hancock College. She earned a PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin and taught at universities and community colleges in 3 states before starting her career at Allen Hancock College. Welcome, Kate. Our next panelist is Kelly Cohn. Kelly Cohn is an assistant professor and librarian here at Hancock. Kelly manages the fake news and fact-checking guide created by the Hancock Library staff for online reference. Welcome, Kelly. Next, we have Marga Cooley. Marga Cooley is the managing editor for the Santa Maria Times, Lee Central Coast newspapers, which includes the Lompoc Record and the Santa Ynez Valley News. Marga is a 40-year veteran in the field of journalism. Welcome, Marga. And our next panelist is Mr. Hugo Morales. He is the founder and executive director of Radio Bilingüe, the National Latino Public Radio Network, headquartered in Fresno and Oakland. He is the educated son of Oaxacan migrant farm workers and has won numerous awards, including the Edward R. Murrow Award, which is public broadcasting's highest award. Welcome, Hugo. And last but not least, and as you have seen, we're going in alphabetical order. We have Jerry Roberts. He is the founder of CalBuzz and a frequent TV commentator. Jerry is a former managing editor of the San Francisco Chronicle and a former editor of the Santa Barbara News Press. He, along with other staff, resigned in protest against publisher Wendy McCaw's interference with editorial news judgment. They later won an Ethics in Journalism Award from the Society of Professional Journalists and also the Payne Award for Ethics in Journalism at the University of Oregon. Welcome, Jerry. What I would like to do now is to go through our format so everyone kind of is aware of what we have planned for today. Also, I would like you to know that if you have to leave at any time for any reason, please feel free to get up and leave. That's fine with everybody. And the format that we have agreed to, the League has used for several years, and we are most pleased that the panelists have agreed to this format. Initially, I was going to say candidate, thank heavens you're not candidates, our panelists will be giving an opening statement that will last about 2 minutes. We have timers in the front row who will indicate when 30 seconds is up and then when time is up. After that opening statement, then each candidate will entertain, we have 2 questions that they have received ahead of time. So with that, we will start with Dr. Adams first, go alphabetically down the line. Then the second question, we will begin with Kelly Cohn and end up with Dr. Adams. Then we will have an intermission. During that time, we are asking you to submit written questions that you have developed during the course of this first part of the program. The questions can be addressed to an individual panelist, or they can be general questions addressed to all. If a question is addressed to a particular panelist, the other panelists will also be given the opportunity to respond if they so desire. And each response to those questions will last again 2 minutes. We will try and end around 20 to 3 or 2:45 to 3 so that each panelist will be able to give a concluding statement of about 1 minute or so in length. So, are everybody ready? And again, if you feel free to get up and leave, and those of you live streaming, feel free to submit your questions. So we will begin, first of all, with Dr. Adams giving her introductory statement.
Such a pleasure to be here. And thanks to the League of Women Voters in Hancock, the Fund for Santa Barbara, and the Santa Maria Times for putting this together. I'm representing, in a way, Hancock and my discipline. I'm a professor of English. What, you might ask, does a professor of English have to say about fake news? Well, in a way, English professors we're professional readers. We are highly trained readers. And I'm here to tell you that this highly trained reader has fallen victim, probably more than once in my life, to fake news. So as a professional trained reader, I am here to say that all of us are in the same boat when it comes to critical reading and the decisions that we make based on what we know from reading. And I'll offer, just in closing, 4 questions that I learned from a mentor of mine, another professor of English. I call them the De Araujo Quartet because her name was De Araujo. Those 4 questions, which keep me from falling victim to fake news and to falsehood, are: who is the speaker? Who is the audience? What is the message being sent? And what is the language being used? I've found that those 4 questions sort of activate my critical reading attention and serve me in good stead when I am thumbing through headlines or doing other dangerous activities such as that.
Hi, thank you for having me. Thank you again to the League. This is such a privilege, distinguished company here. I'm here today as a librarian, probably representing most librarians and educators who have a real concern that students do not know how to locate good journalism. They have this belief that all media is biased, it's untrustworthy, and this belief in fake news is leading to a false sense of how to use information literacy. Information literacy is incredibly important, especially to librarians. This is what we teach. This was a phrase coined in the 70s that radically transformed what librarians do. And basically what we do is teach skills to students so that they can be informed readers and critics of information. My point is that this is our wheelhouse for librarians. This is what we do. We're fact checkers. And we're also natural allies for educators and parents. And I think it's really important that these information literacy skills are being taught not only in the classroom, but at home, and by modeling good research behavior. There's lots of things we can get into as far as how to do that, and I'm sure we will. But that is my main goal here, is to hopefully bring admin and educators and parents and all of us together so that we're producing better informed citizens that know how to skeptically, healthy bit of skepticism is always great. Read news and determine for themselves, if this is something they should share. Thank you.
I too want to thank the League of Women Voters for the invitation to be here, because this topic is so important to our society, and it's important to me as a journalist. As was stated, I've been a journalist for 40 years, and what we've called fake news since the 2016 election, though more complex now, has been around for a lot longer than that. Like radio and the introduction of television, what we have today is new technology and a new way of accessing fake news. And having fake news fed to us through social media that's able to micro-target American voters down to groups of 25 through face recognition and algorithms with headlines that appeal to their individual predispositions to generate clicks and likes. What we also have is a society that doesn't take the time to educate itself, a growing number of people who read sound bites and feed off misinformation without taking the time that's required, now more than ever, to follow multiple sources, learn what news organizations and digital sites are credible and which are opinion-based or just entertainment. What we also have is the lack of investment in the importance of a free press in our society and the degradation of our newsrooms, most importantly at the local level, because local news is the lifeblood of democracy in many ways. It helps people understand what's going on in the world around them and is accountable to its readership. This spiral has created an information vacuum. I believe people want to learn things. If you don't have access to information that's vetted and solid, you'll absorb misinformation. You'll read what's there. I vividly remember when computers were introduced to our newsroom at the Imperial Valley Press in 1984, where I covered city government. In the 30-plus years since, letters to the editor have been mostly replaced by comments on social media, and that's just one change. Everybody can suddenly be published and appear on equal footing. Social media altered the way people consume media and are alerted to the existence of news. Photographic evidence used to be seen as an impeccable standard, no longer is. And the internet has destroyed a lot of the business models that were supporting media through advertising. So how do you stop the flood? I don't think it's possible. Every time there's new technology, the advent of radio, the advent of television, social media wasn't even in the social lexicon of the world 10 years ago. What we have to remember is we're still dealing with new technology and people are still learning. They're learning how to distinguish between what's real and what's not. And if things seem extremely hopeless, and they do sometimes, this is not unprecedented. It's been solved, and it'll be solved again, and I hope we'll take some steps to doing that at this forum. Thank you.
My name is Hugo Morales, and thank you again to the League. I also want to thank everybody else who has been part of organizing this forum. And I want to say that I'm glad to be invited, since about 70% of the population in Santa Maria is Latino. And that's something that I think is very relevant to fake news, in that if you were to tune in to any radio service in Spanish here in Santa Maria or across the United States, it's a news desert. There is no news. It may sound shocking, but it's true. I think a lot of that have access to education and have access to the English language, can digest it, sometimes feel inundated by information. And when it comes to the Spanish speaking, many of whom, of course, thousands, over 70,000 here in Santa Maria, do not have that access, cannot appreciate that or have access to that information to be able to be responsible and contributing citizens of this community and this country. And that's what Radio Bilingüe, came and has been here now almost a year, because our service is so important in terms of news and information. And I think as we look at what can we do, I think we need to support newspapers. I'm glad I'm following Martha. We need to support our newspapers. We need to support our journalists, our serious journalists. We also need to support education. And I think I'm glad the librarian here, the English professors here, and also incredible, strong, ethical journalist. We really need to have these kind of elements. And we also need to have a strong education system, particularly at elementary level. I'm a CSU trustee, so I obviously believe in higher education, but if you don't have a citizenry that can read and write, it's a real tragedy for democracy. So I'm a real supporter not just of education, but also dual immersion education in communities like Santa Maria, so that everybody can learn to read and write from preschool. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jerry. I'm here as a journalism practitioner, someone that's been about 40 years also in the business. And I want to congratulate the League on convening this. I don't think there is any more important issue for our culture and for our country. I think part of the importance is shown in the Collins Dictionary every year publishes the most important word of the year, the one that's affected the culture the most. And in 2017, it was fake news. No less a figure than Pope Francis has recently addressed the issue. And he traced fake news back to the book of Genesis, with the serpent telling Eve to eat fruit from the forbidden tree. He said, this biblical episode brings to light an essential element for our reflection. There is no such thing as harmless disinformation. On the contrary, trusting in falsehood can have dire consequences. I think a lot of us tend to immediately associate the term fake news with President Trump, not least because he used the phrase 150 times in tweets last year. But I would argue that President Trump is not the cause of this. He's really just a symptom. And that what's happened over the last several decades to our society is that we have moved out of what's been called the age of exposition, when people were informed by the printed word and its implicit requirement that arguments be rooted in logic and evidence, and it's been replaced by an age of show business. There's a great book I would recommend called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, a great journalist, written in 1985. And he talked about dystopian futures, and he said that he feared the future of George Orwell, put forth in 1984, less than that of Aldous Huxley. He said Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. And I think that's the context in which we should talk about fake news, in which and take a step back a little bit from the politics of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are all of the panelists able to see our timer holding up signs?
Do some of us seem like we're not?
No, I just wanted to make sure we were all looking. Okay. And again, let me just remind you that who are watching the live stream to go to tweet at Santa Maria Times to submit your written questions. And you here in the audience, again, hopefully you received a card when you came in. If not, you can raise your hand to write a written question that you would like to have addressed. So thank you very much. Now we will begin with the part of today's presentation wherein each panelist will begin addressing the first question that was submitted to them in your letter your letter of invitation to participate today. The first question is really basic. What is fake news? Dr. Adams, we'll begin with you and then go down. 2 minutes. Thank you.
So I have a 17-year-old stepdaughter who goes to high school, and whenever she disagrees with anything you say, whether it's you didn't take out the trash or whatever, global, micro, macro, when she disagrees with you, she bellows. She would probably not call it bellowing. Fake news, that's what she says, right? So in her group, fake news has turned into a kind of slang term for anything that you disagree with. I'm thinking about that, how has fake news become slang for everything she disagrees with? Well, partly it would be the use of the term by the current president, right? Because when he disagrees with something, he calls it fake news, right? In tweets. But I actually don't blame Trump so much as I blame attention, and I don't know if I'm making this word up, virality, when things go viral. Slang is a thing that isn't slang until it's gone viral, until enough people in your peer group or wherever you're hanging out use that term to mean certain kinds of things. More important than virality, though, is attention. And my definition of fake news, stick with me here because it's a little philosophical. Fake news is what we believe when we are not paying attention. Fake news is what we believe when we're not paying attention. Or we might put it this way, fake news is what we read when we're not paying attention. And that's a huge amount. I don't care how much you read. I certainly read a lot, but I am not always paying attention when I am reading. And I think that's a sort of key understanding to fake news. In other words, I'm really saying that fake news is in our heads. Fake news is kind of something that is really about us, about our critical reading or attention to what comes in at us.
I too am an avid reader, and I've been looking at fake news for a while. Fake news isn't really new to librarians. It's something we've dealt with, whether it be fake academic journals or data and things like that. We're always kind of digging around for the truth. But if I had to define it, I would define fake news as something that is verifiably false, and it could potentially mislead readers. I will say with that, there's a lot of levels and categories that could be encompassed with that. You touched on this in your opening. It's not just, oh, this is a fake headline and then a fake news article written by a Russian agency. It could be as simple as something that you know is fake, or maybe you don't recognize it at first. It's something written by The Onion, or it's from the Borowitz report from The New Yorker. It's a fake news article written to be fake, but it's satirical. That's still fake news, but again, that's a different category than what you may find as far as like CNN is kind of guilty of this. They trump up headlines. Everything is breaking news with them. Even though it's a mainstream, pretty, nonpartisan network, they are guilty of trumping up things, and that can lead to more fake news. People may be believing something based on a headline. One really good example of this is that there was a satirical news website. It's now defunct, but they published the article that Pope Francis had endorsed President Trump during the election. This was fake. This did not happen, but that one fake news story was shared over 1 million times on Facebook. And that's just on Facebook, not Twitter or anything else, just on Facebook over 1 million times. So it does get dangerous as far as what people believe. If someone just gets on Facebook, sees that headline, is like, oh, well, I'm a devout Catholic, I'm voting for Trump now. That's where we get, some pretty sticky areas. So I think we just have to have an open mind and, really think about what we're reading before we proceed and share and like and click.
Fake news is a term that was coined in the 2016 election primarily, but what we're really talking about is true versus false. Wikipedia has a pretty specific definition for fake news. They call it a type of yellow journalism that consists of deliberate misinformation or hoaxes spread via traditional print and broadcast news, media, or online social media. Fake news is written and published with the intent to mislead and to gain financially or politically. And that's really a specific point, often with sensationalist, exaggerated, or patently false headlines that grab attention. I see fake news as multifaceted. It's something that's hard to put into a box. When Donald Trump talks about fake news, he's usually talking about what he perceives as biased news. Since the start of 2016, a survey by the network research showed 1/3 of respondents have started to lose trust in the reliability of information presented by media outlets as a result of the proliferation of fake news. The loss of trust is highest amongst millennials at a 38% reduction, and exposure to fake news is a key driver in that loss of trust. Almost half of those that think they've been exposed to fake news claim a reduction in trust compared to only 1/5 of those who did not think they had previously been exposed. An interesting part of this is a look at the Fairness Doctrine, which was a regulation at the beginning of the television era in the late 1940s, which required that both sides be presented, primarily on television and radio. In the late 1980s, it was eliminated by the FCC. So The loss is pointed to by some as a contributing factor in the rising level of party polarization, and can also be, attributed to what we've seen in the rise of fake news. In about 2 years after that, political talk shows started showing up. All of a sudden, you don't have both sides on TV or radio, and a whole ecosystem developed. So you're not getting both sides of the picture. When the internet comes in, you have an audience primed to not hear both sides. You also have the fact that the journalism model for mainstream media is collapsing because of the internet. An opinion is cheaper than real journalism. People can't afford that anymore, and the money doesn't exist. So people begin throwing opinion online and, barely paying people for it. A lot of what you see in this opinion comes from the most respected organizations, but it's not paid for. So, is that fake news? Thank you.
I think that, well, thank you. I agree with your description of fake news. It's deliberate misinformation. And I think as we get more and more of that fake news, we have to consider how some populations or individuals may become particularly vulnerable. To the impact of fake news, of fake news. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Mexican population, how a presidential candidate launches his campaign with fake news, that we Mexicans are criminals and rapists. That's his opening speech. That's really, really toxic. I think that's an invitation to violence against Mexicans. I think he believes that somehow there's a latent or some kind of residual belief and hatred against Mexicans that he wants to untap. At least that's how I take it as a Mexican. And I think we need to be cognizant of that, because I think for us Mexicans, that's a real reality. It's a real reality. And it's not just about Mexicans from Mexico, which is that's for words. It really means to everybody that's a Mexican or a Mexican extraction. And I think a lot of folks in our community who were born here, I'm an immigrant from Oaxaca, Mexico, like thousands of people here in Santa Maria, but millions who've been born and raised in the United States, including Santa Maria, become vulnerable to in that situation. I think we need to consider the consequences of fake news on vulnerable populations. Thank you.
There's been a lot covered, and I agree with much of what's been said. I think fake news is almost a Rashomon phenomenon, where it really depends on your perspective. And I think in day-to-day use, as Kate said, it becomes easy to use for any number of issues. But I think there's a number of things conflated. Fake news originally was commercially driven, sensational, and made-up content. And many of you remember the famous website in Macedonia where there were some teenagers who were creating, among other things, the Pope backs Trump headline because they were able to sell ads, because it was a revenue source, and they were literally making them up. So that's kind of the origin of fake news. Fake news often is used to refer to partisan media sources, Fox News, MSNBC, and I think Marga makes the point about polarization and political tribalism is very important in the context. Basically, we tend to avoid differing opinions and get our news and media silos, so anything with which we disagree politically is fake news. There's a new phenomenon. There's fake political news sites. The Lompoc Record cited this in a really good editorial last week about something called the Arizona Messenger, which is a completely made-up paper. But a candidate launched a website without saying where their funding was coming from, which attributed to all these great things from the Arizona Messenger. Here in California, Devin Nunes from Fresno, the congressman, has something called the California Republican. And it does the same thing. It's disguised as a news organization, and it's just a partisan information. Obviously, the social media has been what's been responsible for the light speed at which fake news spread. There's no barrier to entry there, and We can talk about Russians and algorithms and things like that. I think Kelly mentioned The Onion and satire. And then I think President Trump really comes into a special category of his own. And I think the phrase alternative facts, which his spokesperson used on the first Sunday after his inauguration, will become a watchword which we're going to remember in American history for a long time.
Thank you very much. Now we will begin with the second question that each panelist received in their invitation letter. We will begin with Ms. Cohn to answer that. Also, I just might remind you, hopefully you're formulating a question, writing it down so that we can pick it up in a little bit and proceed then after intermission with the second part of the program. The second question is, what can we do to combat fake news and media bias? What can we do to combat fake news and media bias? Kelly?
I think ultimately we all have to learn how to become critical and responsible consumers of news. We have to, say you're scrolling through your Facebook feed, take a step back when you come across, a sensational headline, and do just a little bit of research. Just take a second, take that headline, Google it, search for that news story, see if it comes up anywhere else. Is it only on social media or blogs? Do major news outlets carry this story? There's little things you can do. I think you all got a flyer. On the back of it is little tips on how to spot fake news. These are little simple things that you can do when you're online, you're on Twitter, social media. Just do just a basic research. Stop and look at the author. You can search for the author on LinkedIn. Google the website. Do they have a mission statement? One thing I came across, which is really good for not only journalists, but I think consumers of news, is the Society of Professional Journalists has a code of ethics. And I think we could absolutely use those code of ethics when we're taking in news and reading things, because they really consider, the sources. Are there unnamed sources? Do they explain why those sources are unnamed? Is there any bias? There's just little things that you can check that can help you combat fake news. And again, like I said before, and I think if you're doing these little things, you can monitor that and mirror that, and your peers, your family, your children, your students will kind of catch on and ask you, well, how did you find that? Well, why did you look it up here instead of here, instead of just taking news for face value? Another thing, as far as being responsible news consumers, I'll wrap up, is I think we need to step out of our media bubble or our filter bubble. Everyone is in their cozy little bubble, which is fine. I have my bubble. Kate has her bubble. We all do. Surrounded by the sites and social media that we use every day. But I think it really takes an active researcher, which we all need to really try to become if you really want to combat fake news, and step outside of your little bubble and seek other news sources that may be different from your worldview, and it could be really eye-opening. I'm not saying, the Fox News viewers need to go watch NBC, or vice versa. You don't have to go to the extreme, but you can maybe watch some network news, watch CBS or watch PBS, read the Wall Street Journal. Read something that is mainstream. It's known for not having any bias, and I think just little steps like that could really help us combat this.
I think that Kelly makes a good point in that, using the internet to your advantage is one of the best ways to combat fake news. We talk about technology and is that really, the culprit? The internet has a lot of opportunity for us also to gauge and judge and learn, and we just need to seek out the ways to do that. It's kind of the same concept as somebody whispers in your ear, a rumor about something when you were in grade school, and you sit there and go, well, should I spread this or shouldn't I, Does this really sound like it's the truth, and am I going to be, perpetrating a falsehood by whispering in somebody else's ear? stop and think about what you're doing. There's a lot of discussion and activity that will help you in this decision-making process. There are funds, there are apps, websites like missinfocon.com is a good place to go to look for some suggestions. People are ruled by emotion, and read the articles. Don't just start typing your comments in. Many comments are a telltale sign that people aren't educating themselves. As a newspaper, editor of a local newspaper, one of the things that I hope you can trust, is your local media, is the Santa Maria Times. We take our role very seriously in providing information so our readers know what's going on in our community and can make educated decisions about their local government and what's happening every day. So, and we're accountable. If you have a concern, if you have a question, you can call us. And we'll tell you why we reported something the way we did. Reach out when you can to your media sources and get that feedback. The most important point I can make is use your head. Pay attention to the domain and the URL of what you're reading. Established news organizations usually own their domains and have a standard look. Sites ending in .com, .co should be a tip-off. For example, abcnews.com is a legitimate news source. But abcnews.com, .co is not, even though it has a similar appearance. So read about us, reverse image checks, stuff like that. There's a lot of different options out there.
Well, thank you so much. I agree with the comments by my fellow panelists. And I think, again, I want to return to the importance of education and literacy. I think that's so important. In this community, probably the majority population, which is Latino, does not have a high school education. And probably the majority of them do not have access to broadband because of the poverty. So I think that we need to think about those things and how do we better educate our children, in elementary school in particular, and then again, adult school. We need more literate adults. We need to empower them to be able to digest information. And again, I advocate for dual immersion because there's so many Latinos here that are monolingual Spanish speaking from the home. So I think it's important that our children be able to learn through a language that they understand, both Spanish and so important to have English. I also want to say that it can be worse. In Mexico, the country where I come from, between the year 2000 and today, there's been over 111 journalists killed in Mexico. That is a huge number. To be able to be a journalist in Mexico is a very dangerous job. Can you imagine? And now lately, particularly the last 2 years, women journalists have been more and more targeted. And particularly those journalists, whether men or women, that are aspiring to fulfill the mission of journalism, which is to make the institutions accountable. Those journalists that dare to cover the ties between government and the narco-traficantes, those are the ones that are most vulnerable. So I think that it is time that we look at our institutions of education, support our newspapers, support our journalists here in the U.S., so that that culture of journalism and truth stay with us, because, folks, it can get worse.
I think the most important thing we can do about it is subscribe to a newspaper. I talked about the age of exposition and the need to have facts marshaled in a reasonable and logical way. Again, referencing this editorial in the record, they said one thing is certain about the fake news phenomena. It is shining a spotlight on legitimate news agencies which work to get to the truth. For us newspaper folks, it's a matter of vetting, revetting, and vetting a third time. Checking facts for their validity has always been a basic procedure of print media, but that process has taken on greater significance since the era of fake news blossomed. So subscribing to a newspaper not only is a matter of self-interest, but to help newspapers. I mean, Margaret can talk about this as well, but 2008 was really a watershed year. That's when we had a recession, and Facebook and Google really began to dominate online advertising. Now about 75% worldwide. They control that revenue. Reporting is expensive. You have to pay reporters. You have to pay health care. Sometimes you send people out for a week or 2 weeks to get a story, and the story's not there. And you have to admit that and say, okay, we're not going to do this story. But it was worth making the effort to get it. So I think supporting a local newspaper, which I think is who's covering the city council, who's covering the school board, and if there's nobody doing it, we're all in a lot of trouble. So I think supporting that local watchdog role as well as national news organizations, and I think the New York Times and the Washington Post particularly have really stepped up and done tremendous investigative reporting and fact-checking with organizations like PolitiFact. So that would be the first thing I would say. And I also think the media needs to do a better job of explaining how we do our work, because I think a lot of people are not aware of it. They aren't aware of multiple layers of editing. And these surveys show that a large percentage of people think that journalists just fabricate stuff. And I just want to finish this section. There's a quote from Dean Baquet of the New York Times. He says, "We spent our whole lives thinking that people assumed that we were honorable people. People assumed we were trying to find out what actually happened. I think we were wrong." And that's so true, because I think print journalists particularly have not made the transition to an online world, and we need to do a better job of explaining what it is we do.
So I want to go back to something that Hugo Morales said. He reminded us that by referencing Trump's announcement of his presidential campaign and the way in which he talked about criminals and rapists and good people of Mexico. And then he reminded me of something I knew but I had forgotten until this moment, which is journalism is a hugely dangerous occupation. People get killed for reporting the news, 111 in the last 18 years in Mexico. This reminds me that fake news is a form of violence. It is, I think your word for it was toxic. It's toxic information. And here's an example of the way in which fake news governs us all. According to research I've done, according to surveys done at various points in the United States over the last, few years, few months, Americans overwhelmingly support, I've seen as much as high as 80%, overwhelmingly support DACA recipients, deferred action for childhood arrival, students brought to this country, or people brought to this country when they were children, who have no formal legal relationship to the country, yet have only a relationship to this country because they've been here since they were 3 or 7 or 2 or whatever. Overwhelmingly, Americans say that they support a way forward, a regularization of the status of DACA immigrants. And yet, as far as the media is concerned, as Congress is concerned, we're in complete sort of, what would you call it, conflict, gridlock. Yes, Kate makes the sign for gridlock. We're in complete gridlock about this, right? So although Americans support a thing, our Congress and our media seem to be working as if there is no overwhelming support, that it's really a flip of the coin. We don't know how we feel about DACA. That's a toxic effect, I think, of fake news as well. And I'm supposed to stop talking. So I will.
2 minutes goes by way too fast, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay, hopefully you can finish your thoughts later on in the program. Okay, this is the time when we take an intermission where you can all get up, stand up. But before you do that, if you have a question written down, please hold it up so that we can come and get it. And again, if you do have to leave at any time, feel free to. And we thank all of you for the questions that you submitted. We got a lot. And please do not be offended if we don't have time to answer yours. As I say, we got a lot of them. That's so much better than not having enough questions. What we have decided to do is we will start with Marga Cooley with a question. She'll have 2 minutes to answer it. Then if each of you would like to respond, you'll have a minute to add. That way then we can reach more questions. Hopefully that's in agreement. Thank you very much. Okay, Martha, what is journalistic ethics and what role does it have in fake news? What is journalistic ethics and what role does it have in fake news?
Journalistic ethics apply to the rules that we follow as journalists on a day-to-day basis. And that involves researching the stories that we write, asking questions to document the information that we're publishing, making sure that both sides of an issue are represented, being as representative in a headline as possible regarding the content of the article. There are also ethics that apply to photojournalism. The idea that manipulating a photo is not ethical from a journalistic standpoint, that we try to use photos to illustrate a story, not to sensationalize it, and how those relate to fake news is that at times, most of the time, fake news tends to do the exact opposite. They use headlines that don't illustrate the substance, the context of what the article is about. They use headlines that grab your attention and usually try to answer a point that you might already want to know the answer to, so that you click on what it is they're presenting. They use photos at times irresponsibly. They use them as captures to attract you to an article that has been put out so that you'll click on it, but many times it has absolutely no support when you get into the article, spend the time to read it. So I think those are some pretty surface level aspects, comparisons, but that's a good foundation.
Thank you. Anyone else? Jerry?
I would just add that journalistic ethics is actually a fairly recent invention. I think 1926 was the first time in American journalism that they were actually codified. I think for most of the history of the Republic, it was kind of anything goes. If you go back to William Randolph Hearst and yellow journalism and things of that category. The issue now is that since the advent of the internet, journalistic ethics have increasingly going by the wayside. There's no online journalistic ethics. There's no code for that. But if you're interested in what the principles are of journalistic ethics, the best source is the Society of Professional Journalists, SPJ Code of Ethics, SPJ Code of Ethics. You can find it online.
Anyone else?
Here's the SPJ Code of Ethics right here.
Or you can find it at the end of the table.
And I just want to read one item from a multiple list of things. Remember that neither speed nor format excuses inaccuracy. Speed nor format excuses inaccuracy. And I would argue that there is a digital ethics, but it's, people violate it all the time. But so do we, as readers, violate the need to slow down, right, to attend to what we're reading. And we would be much less likely to click on the things that you were talking about, Marga, if we were slowing down, right? Speed does not help us when we want to be critical readers.
Kelly Arugo?
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, I want to thank my panelists. I think those are very good examples and excellent explanation of what ethics are in journalism. But I just want to again reflect on the Latino experience, how in the Spanish world, Spanish media world, there is, I would think, fake misrepresentations, which in fact are, to me, fake news. And if you look at or listen to Spanish language radio or see Univision, you're going to see a lot of content that is anti-woman. anti-gay, homophobic, racist. That's the kind of thing that goes over. And of course, if you look at the ownership of Univision, it's not owned by Latinos, by the way, and only about 3% or so of radio stations in the U.S. Are owned by Latinos. So I think, to me, there is a culture which is allowing these misrepresentations to go forward. In fact, a lot of folks that are not familiar with the Latino community think that Latinos are being served because of Univision and the Spanish language media that does exist, when in fact, in my assessment, is not a service, it's a disservice for the most part.
Thank you. This question will be addressed to you, Mr. Morales, and it's kind of a follow-up or an expanded question on what you just addressed. How does cultural background affect whether an audience believes fake news? How does cultural background affect whether an audience believes fake news?
Well, as I was talking earlier about how a cultural or a sector of a culture, or Latinos, for example, can become the target of this. It's not just Latinos. It can be women. It can be, a vulnerable population. It can be Asians. And I think that's why we need to be so militant about the importance of the integrity of our news services and supporting newspapers, supporting the ideas and the principles of journalism. Because if we don't, and we let those misrepresentations go on as, oh, that's just entertainment, or that's just the way it is, little by little, we may be losing our own integrity, and our own may blur the difference between truth and misrepresentation, to the detriment of particularly vulnerable individuals or populations.
I would just more broadly in the culture, I think one of the issues that affects us is the decline of teaching civics in school. There was a recent poll by the First Amendment Coalition that 1/4 of Americans can name the 3 branches of government. And more than 1/3 cannot name a single right that is guaranteed under the First Amendment. And there's a lot of things like that. And I just think that our education about these kinds of issues has really declined in recent decades. So, when we talk about what can we do to combat fake news, I think any way we can encourage the teaching of civics in our schools as well as media literacy is a big positive.
I think also, in addition to the cultural aspects of this, the politically structured aspects of a country or an area that you come from lead you to be less than receptive to what may appear as information that's being provided for you, and you react differently to it. So, if you are from a country where consumption of news that has a foundation, that has research that goes into it, is not part of the norm, you tend to accept things that may not meet those expectations. So it's really important to read and to educate yourself about the parameters that of the country that you're in, and the legitimacy of the content that you're reading, so that you can put those kind of expectations aside and become involved on a different level.
Anyone else?
No. I'm good.
All right, we will go on then with our next question, and this was directed to you, Jerry. What is your biggest concern regarding the future of legitimate news or journalism, and what happens if newspapers lose so much revenue they have to cut the quality of fact-checking?
Well, I think that's already happened. My biggest concern, it's twofold. One is certainly financial, and the fact that it's become more and more difficult to support in-depth, investigative, analytical enterprise journalism is certainly a piece of it. More broadly, I think my concern is just the death of truth. Not to be dramatic about things, but when facts and opinion start to be the same thing, then we're in a lot of trouble. Senator Moynihan famously said everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own set of facts. But I think we're moving very quickly to a position where everyone does feel they're entitled to their own set of facts, and we become so politically divided by tribes that people suspect anything that the other side puts forward in terms of facts. So all of the traditional things that newspapers have done in terms of reporting facts, interpreting facts, putting facts forward is in danger if people are no longer living in a fact-based universe. And so I would say those are my two biggest concerns. And as for what happens, I'm not sure. I mean, I think everybody's still trying to figure it out. And obviously, in 10 years or 5 years, or I don't know how many years, Margaret can tell me, the last print newspaper reader is going to pass away. And it's, so the future's online, but it's difficult to make money online because with a newspaper that's based on advertising revenue, you have a limited amount of space. On the internet, you have infinite space, and so what you can charge for an ad is so much smaller. So I think that's why you see organizations like the Washington Post and the New York Times increasingly moving towards subscription models rather than advertising models. And I think it's going to be a case if people are willing to pay for quality information, and I just have to be optimistic and hope that eventually the preponderance of evidence argument wins out.
Anyone else?
I'm going to be a resisting reader a little bit here in the definition of how journalism has worked through the disruptive elements of the digital revolution. I mean, one of the problems I see in journalism is that, in publishing in general, is in order to remain relevant, in order to, garner an audience, journalism too has muddied the water or the dividing line between entertainment and information, news and information. Fox News or MSNBC both have news reporters, and they also have opinion makers. Rush Limbaugh was sort of the first famous entertainer to use information as his material, who said, "I'm not a journalist, I'm an entertainer." Right? I'm not a radio journalist, but an entertainer. And it's not just folks like folks with partisan opinions or points of view in journalism that have muddied this divide. We're all down there, sort of in the mud, trying to find an audience. And I think audiences for journalism and for entertainment can take control of that, by being, sorry, I'm a broken record, I'm an English teacher, being a more critical reader, understanding, who is the speaker, who is the audience, what is the message being sent, and what kind of language is being used here, and why should I care about it? Why does that shape the message in a variety of ways? In my own critical reading, can I say one more thing? This is a good one, I think. In my own critical reading, one of the things that I have trained myself over the last year to do is what some pundit called click restraint. I just don't click on stuff. I mean, I use social media the way the rest of you do, and journalism is right in there in my social media trying to grab my eyeballs. Legitimate journalism. But I just restrain from clicking on stuff I'm pretty sure is, I don't know, an ad farm, clickbait. I work really hard to only go to sources that I know are legit.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I do have one quick comment. Contrary to Jerry, I believe that the print model is going to be around for more than 10 years. I think it will change. I think that there are going to be more long-form articles, that there will be more of a magazine style as we go forward. and that it'll be modified by more of the breaking news and the immediacy online, and that we need to find a way to capitalize on that and to make that as legitimate as we perceive the print model to be at this point, and turn that to a way that we can monetize it. And that's part of the process that we're struggling with right now, is to find a way to monetize that effectively and support both those types of journalism.
Can I just quickly respond to the, I hope you're right, Margaret. I really do hope you're right, but I'll bet you $100 you're not. But
You're on.
I mean, the problem obviously is the huge overhead that you have to pay for to do that. There's no such barrier of entry to publishing online. But certainly I hope that even if it's a high-priced product, I mean, people pay $7.50 for a copy of the New Yorker, so people will pay for quality, that continues, but that we also find a way to do high-quality
The model will have to
journalism.
change, certainly.
I was just going to say, I love the quote from Senator Moynihan. It's, I think it gets down to we have to reestablish some trust. There are experts. Not all media is biased, and we need to put that out there. And, facts are facts, and you cannot will away something by not believing in it. You're not going to, will away climate change. Climate change is happening. We just have to really drive that home, in that you really have to trust the experts. There's hard data. There's information out there. And if it doesn't, fit in your worldview, that's okay. And you can be critical and do some more investigating, but you still have to trust the experts.
Thank you. The next question, Kate, we'll ask you to begin. Can you share some additional examples or stories of news suppression?
There's a journalistic organization, the name of which I forget right now, which used to publish every year the top 10 most underreported stories. There is an organization called ProPublica, which does investigative journalism in what I believe is a nonprofit format. I don't think they're a for-profit outfit, but I could be wrong about that. And that site is a place where I go to find news that has been suppressed. In other words, there are a lot of reasons that mainstream media doesn't report on what I want to know about, on what I need to know about, on what will help me make informed decisions and be a more informed citizen. And it's up to me to go sort of find those sources. So I guess I'm answering the question by suggesting places to go, and ProPublica would be one of those places to look for suppressed news. I also like Masha Gessen of the New York Times. She's a downer, kind of like Jerry. She's not cynical, but she's kind of resigned in some ways, for good reason, given her experience in both Russia and the United States as an out lesbian reporter. And she's done a lot of reporting, Masha Gessen, over the last year, that uses both her Russian experience and her American experience to talk to why we have to be vigilant in the United States in order to hold on to those rights that Jerry says only a third of us can name, in the First Amendment. Not Jerry says, but that survey said.
I'm too depressed to even respond. No, could I just cite one quick example? There have been a number of stories about how lawyers for Mr. Trump would buy the stories of women with whom he had relationships that were about to make them public and sell them to the fellow who runs the National Enquirer and all those other magazines we love to read it in the supermarket line, and they would then suppress them. So I think that's an example of how that can work sometimes. And then I think also if you see a lot of the reporting on sexual harassment and the Me Too movement, that Harvey Weinstein, the producer in Hollywood, that there were a number of news organizations, the Hollywood Reporter and others, that knew about it, that knew what was going on, but that they were essentially bought off until the New York Times finally broke that story.
Anyone else?
I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of stories out there that it's not that they maybe weren't published as much as, I don't think they got as much attention as they deserved, like net neutrality. That's a really big issue, and that affects everyone. And if you weren't actively seeking it out or clicking on the right news sources, you're not going to really learn about it and see how that affects you and see that you should be calling, your senator and, really trying to affect a change with this. That's just one example, but I think there's just stories out there that aren't very sexy. Net neutrality isn't very sexy, but it's really a big story and it affects everyone. And I think that's just one example of it just kind of gets pushed down.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that especially in this day and age where a story like net neutrality, which is not a very sexy story, doesn't get the page views, doesn't get the readership that we would like to see. I think that while we certainly report that, it's not a suppression, it doesn't get the same time spent on it that, a story of a shooting downtown or, a bank robbery might get, because more people are engaged with that, especially from a local media standpoint, and that's partly of what I'm speaking from. Those stories are glossed over at a certain level. And one of the examples I have is, we did a very extensive 5-part series on the legalization of marijuana that ran right before January 1st. And, we got really positive feedback, but we also got some negative feedback because I don't want to know about this. I don't care about this. This isn't something that I want to spend time on. And at the same time, this is a very significant issue for our area. Santa Barbara County has the second highest number of licenses approved for marijuana growing, second to Humboldt County. And people need to know that. They need to understand how that affects, their life and their bottom line. So that's part of it.
Thank you. Okay, our next question, Kelly, we will ask that you address it first. There are sites that appeared on my phone, like Horn, which are toxic and 90% fake. How did these get on my phone with no provocation?
Oh, man. Everything is driven by an algorithm. All of your social media, your browsers have algorithms, which basically an algorithm is like a recipe. It's a step-by-step process that's encoded into the software to return select results. And once you are using your favorite social media site or your favorite browser, those get filtered and filtered. But sometimes, there's going to be random things like porn or shopping. Sometimes that does come up where it's not something you maybe actively searched or, seeked. But with that, a lot of times it's just paid advertisement. It's bots that get prime placement. A lot of these places get a lot of clicks. So they just generate more and more likes, and that makes them kind of prevalent, and they pop up top of your news feed. Or if you used a certain word in a search before, or you read a news article on porn and the industry and, how it treats women or something like that, there's still a connection that's been made that's going to give you a random ad for porn. It's all kind of connected. But basically these algorithms is what is creating your little happy filter bubble. And it's for everything. All of your feeds are curated. So, if I were to, right now here in this auditorium, Google Walmart on my Google Pixel through a Google Chrome browser, what's amazing is that Google Chrome uses what's been said is like 57 factors before they return a search. So these algorithms are considering what type of device you're using, what type of browser you're using, where you actually physically are. You know, are you on a laptop? Are you on a phone? And then my results are going to be curated for me. So if I Googled Walmart, sure, I'll get their website and I'll get, sorry, I'm almost done. I'll get, you know, the nearest Walmart and their map, but I'm probably also going to get an article from the New York Times on low wages for Walmart workers, because I read the New York Times, Google knows that, and that's something that they would think would be interesting to me. Kate here could get completely different results. She might be a Walmart shopper, so she's going to get, I don't know, she might get, you know, coupons or recipes from Pinterest using Walmart ingredients, things like that. So, sorry, I could go on and on about algorithms and things all day, but yes.
Thank you. For our next forum, you can continue. How about that? Anyone else care to address that?
Well, in spite of the fact that she said I was a Walmart shopper, I want to give props to Kelly for pulling back the curtain behind our use of this technology, of our phones, for example, of the internet to find answers for whatever. We are primarily consumers of a thing that is really, really complicated in its delivery, in its logistics, right? The way in which results are delivered to us it's driven by money, it's driven by media, it's driven by clicks, it's driven by bots, by little pieces of automated software doing things and telling other things to do things. All of this goes into what are my top 10 Google results and what are your top 10 Google results. The problem is that we're paying way too much attention to the top 10 Google results, right? I mean, that's the problem. And part of that is because we love convenience, we love to be served, we live in a service economy, and this magical machine will give us an answer in nanoseconds, and we're satisfied with that first answer. We shouldn't be. We should all slow down and read deeper, read beyond the first 10, Google searches. That's it.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Can I follow up? Is that allowed?
At the conclusion. Okay. We will go on then, and Marga, we would ask that you address this first. Could newspapers fact-check letters to the editor before they print them? Would this be legal? Would it be ethical?
Legal and ethical, yes, it would. But, letters to the editor, and that's where the division between fact and opinion come in at a certain level. There are certainly facts that are contained in letters to the editor, and we do, when there are obviously egregious factual errors, we do either contact that person and let them know that they need to, rework that letter before we publish it. But there's also a fine line between opinion and what is not opinion. So we try to walk that. We do fact check some of them. We try to publish as much as we can to give people a voice, because everybody has an opinion and has a right to an opinion, and that's what our editorial page is about, is giving them a voice. And I think part of I think Jerry mentioned the disconnect between readers and understanding how newspaper content and journalism is put together is the opinion page. There are different components to the opinion page, and my perspective on it is that it's an opportunity to get a lot of different perspectives. It's not a singular voice that we're projecting, on the community. And to do that, I value our letters to the editor, and I try my best to publish as many of them as I can. I also really encourage guest commentaries, because it gives people an opportunity to get a voice out there that is different and have some diversity. Unfortunately, you know, in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of, it's become very partisan, and I value the letters that kind of take a break from that and look at different topics. But to answer the question, the long and short of it, we do fact check at a certain level. We try to publish as much opinion as we can.
When I was the editorial page editor of the Chronicle, and I imagine Margaret does this as well, the one thing we always did is verify that the letter writer was an actual person, and we asked that when people submitted letters, they did so with a phone number and an address that we could follow up. And just a quick story, we got a strange letter one day that was threatening all kinds of terrible things that were going to happen at the Los Angeles airport, and I kind of tossed it aside and said, this is nuts. And the guy who did the letter to the editor said, you know, I think this is from the Unabomber. And in fact, it was a letter from Ted Kaczynski to the letters to the editor department. And we got our reporter in who was covering that, and he called the FBI. And I skillfully by then had dumped soy sauce from my lunch on it, and also managed to get my fingerprints all over it. So I had to go down to the FBI office to be fingerprinted to make sure that I wasn't the Unabomber. So yeah, we did take some pains.
Did you verify the source?
Can I just make a comment?
Sure, go ahead.
I think it's important when we're talking about opinions and editorials and commentaries. All of those are really important, but I think it's also essential that we are teaching students how to differentiate between opinion, commentary, and actual news, and to look for strong arguments, strong bias. But we get so many students in that when we're talking about like, oh, this is popular, this is scholarly, all these differences between these two, they don't often, you know, recognize essential things like this guy's just spouting his opinion. This is not fact. This is not something you want to quote in your research paper. So again, I think those sections are incredibly important, and it does provide another perspective, which hopefully people are, you know, seeking out to read. But it's also something we need to take into consideration when teaching.
And I want to thank the person who asked that question. You know, do you fact check the letters to the editor? Because clearly that is exactly what you're doing. You yourself, when you're reading letters to the editor, you are acting as your own fact checker. I mean, you might want somebody else to help you with it so you don't have to read, you know, so many letters you don't agree with, but you're being your own fact checker, your own critical reader. And it struck me that the editorial page, which is a phrase that you used a minute ago, that is a quaint notion, right? The editorial page, as if it exists here, but over there is the news pages. And that's not the way we read on the internet. That's not the way we read social media feeds. It's on us to figure out, you know, sort of which post, which headline plus image is commentary, which one's, you know, news or fact-based, and which one's opinion or crazy, you know.
Just real quickly, one of the lines in the SPJ Code of Ethics actually goes to the point of identifying and labeling what's opinion and what's fact, to be able to distinguish, and that's something that's is entirely lost, obviously, on the internet.
Thank you. The next question we would ask Hugo, if you would begin the discussion of this. What can the government do to have better communication with Mexicans through journalism?
Well, I don't know exactly what the government could do. One of them would be that they're going to be respectful and abide by the principles of journalism. I think that would be wonderful. Instead, for example, right now we do have an administration who doesn't believe in global warming and is attacking scientists and firing scientists who are simply doing their work, for example. That's something that we need to be cognizant about. The other thing I think also, one thing we like in terms of like the census right now, the government, the Trump administration is trying to put a question on the questionnaire, about the citizenship of each one of us, which they know will drive away a lot of immigrants, not just Mexicans, but a lot of immigrants will not do, because they do not want a true count, which is what in the principle of the Constitution of the United States. One thing I do want to say is that what we don't want is what is going on in Mexico, and this is something that I gave to the organizers of this forum, you know, a few weeks back, about how the Mexican government is controlling the media in Mexico. And it's an article by the New York Times that came out a couple months ago about the biggest, how would I say, investor in media advertisement in Mexico is the Mexican government itself, which is in Mexico City, and how there's no newspaper or television or radio outlet that can be economically sustained unless they get some Mexican government investment in it, some advertising. And that's really, really sad. So that to the point where there is how would I say, censorship. Many of the journalists, they told the New York Times how they themselves throughout Mexico have to think twice before putting out a story because they wonder whether the boss is going to get upset. He may lose the advertising from the Mexican government. So that has been part of the culture, unfortunate culture of Mexico, in journalism in Mexico now for decades. And it still goes on today. So it's not just the shootings that happen against journalists, but also the self-censorship that happens not just through the violence, the physical violence, which is going on, but also the economic violence, I would say, and attacks by the government itself. And it's interesting how in Mexico it's become the culture of the ruling class. So it's not just it's every major political party in Mexico that is doing this. It's not just the PRI, which is the current controller of the federal government.
Just real quickly, I just want to underscore Hugo's comment on the census story, because that goes back to Kelly and Kate's point about undercover stories. It's a hugely undercovered story and has really massive political implications, because if that happens, among other things, California is going to lose at least 1 and possibly 2 seats in Congress, reduce the Electoral College, and it's part of a broader attempt to punish blue states and reward red states. So that's a story I would hope we'd see more coverage of.
I was just going to say, you know, touching on what Hugo said, is that it's not only Mexico, but Politico came out with this kind of list, and President Trump has used the term fake news 400 times since the election, whether tweeting it, talking about it in news. And since his use of that, other authoritarian leaders, other leaders around the world have started picking that up and using it. And that's suppressing their press in Mexico. It's suppressing press in China, where you have the leader of the Communist Party in China using fake news. You have the total denial of the Rohingya Muslim group with their leadership saying, oh no, this is false news, they don't exist. It's very serious when we have lawmakers and leaders that are using these terms just, you know, to deny anything they don't like. It's hurting journalists. More journalists were incarcerated in the last couple years, killed. It's, you know, been a very, very scary time for journalists over the last 2 years, with fake news being kind of a culprit of that.
And that means, to me, that fake news finally requires something of me beyond even critical reading. It requires me to act. It requires all of us to act in a way on what we read, on what we know. And that's a really hard thing to do, particularly if we are used to interacting with information as if it's free to all, interacting with information as if it's entertainment, as if it's not truly engaged with us, with our reality, with the realities of our friends and neighbors. And for me, fake news' biggest problem is that it deteriorates our desire to be engaged citizens, to be engaged with each other, to be engaged, not just shaking our fists, at our alternative facts, but to be engaged with the whole people and the whole communities that we are. That's even harder than critical reading, I think.
Alrighty. I think we have time for one more question. Unfortunately, the clock kind of determines what happens here on out. So the last question is directed to you, Jerry. Wasn't the, quote, news that Hearst papers printed in World War II about all Japanese Americans being more loyal to Japan than the U.S., was that fake news?
Yes.
Okay. Any other?
Although, there's another famous Hearst story about him allegedly starting the Spanish-American War and famously saying, you provide the pictures, I'll provide the war. And there's a new book out, actually, that looks at historic fake news, and it turns out that story is apocryphal. So, yes on one and no on another for Mr. Hearst.
Thank you. Any other responses, comments? No? Okay. Well, then we've come to almost the end of our program today. We will ask each of you to give a concluding statement of about a minute in duration there, a minute more or less. And we'll begin with you, Mr. Roberts, and then proceed towards Kate.
I thank you all for your attention. I greatly appreciate you listening. I would recommend go Google Marty Barron's speech at Oxford. He's the editor of the Washington Post. He just gave a fabulous speech at Oxford on this subject, and I would urge you all to read it. I think in the end, it comes down to a lot of what Kate's been saying. It's really on us to combat fake news. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, writing on the First Amendment, said, "Every person must be his own watchman for truth, because the forefathers did not trust any government to separate the true from the false for us." And that's certainly as true today as it's been any time, I think, in our country. So I think a lot of what we've heard today about practical ways of doing that is crucial. And then I would just close with another quote from a Yale law professor called Timothy Snyder, writing on this subject. He says, "To abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power because there is no basis upon which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle."
I would end with this. I think if we want to save journalism, we want to save newspapers, we have to pay attention on the needs and culture and the literacy of the Latino community here in Santa Maria and everywhere in the U.S. 70% of the population here in this community is Latino. And I think that, and yet many of us in this room know very little about that community. There's a large segment of this population, for example, that even speaks Spanish, are illiterate. And our radio service, Radio Bilingüe, serves that community every Sunday with Mixteco. I'm a Mixteco myself, an indigenous person from Oaxaca. In our language, in our culture, we have different food, we have different music, we have different values than the Mexican population. I don't know how many of you know that, but that is true. And so I think that we need to unlock that incredible wealth of this community here, which is the future of Santa Maria, whether we like it or not, that's the future. Because that, I think, is a positive thing, making our country stronger. And I think what Donald Trump is doing, he knows that there are folks who are white who are threatened by that demographic. And he's using, that's why he opened his campaign in the way he did, by labeling us Mexicans as criminals. I don't think we need to instead of buying into that, we need to educate about ourselves, about knowing more about that community, but also educating that population. We need these folks to be literate. We need them to read newspapers and appreciate journalism. And that's why literacy is so important, and not just in English, but in whatever their native language may be. Thank you.
I too want to thank you all for being here and spending a little time talking about this subject. I think what I want to leave you all with is the idea that we should never stop looking. Learning the truth is not a goal. It's a process. And as a journalist, I can never express everything in the world in a single day. Saving grace is tomorrow when we try to learn a little bit more. It's the same for me as a news consumer, which I am and which we as journalists are as well. I'll always be learning more. And we're in an age of disinformation. One thing you can do besides not being credulous and passing along incendiary information is to be kind to people who have different opinions. Because the end goal of disinformation is to turn people against each other, is to shatter a national identity, to make people pliable and vulnerable as a nation. And when you have no sense of unity, it makes it extremely easy to make a weak country. In a weak country, the people suffer and the country becomes weaker. It happens all the time, and this is the end result of disinformation.
I too want to thank everyone for being here and listening to all of us. I think that's the first step, and obviously you care enough about this issue to, generously come out here and donate your time here. As much as I'd like to instruct everyone to delete their Facebook, I don't think that's going to happen. But there are steps you can take, and really you just need to take the time. I know it's kind of intimidating, but really take the time to become a better researcher and a better reader. And as Kate has said, slow down before you decide to click, like, post, hashtag, comment, what have you. Really take a second and step back and decide if this is something you really want to share. If it's not something you're really even that sure about it, just trust that as a sign not to share it. And again, thank you for all coming out.
So I would like to close by, one, thanking you for coming out, and two, giving a freebie to students, or reminding them of a couple of things that are available to you, and making a pitch for intellectual humility. Students, did you know that you can get a free subscription to the New York Times? Go to the library. They'll tell you how to do it. As a student at this campus, the New York Times is interested enough in you as a part of their audience that they're willing to give you a free subscription to the New York Times. The librarians can tell you more about that. Also, the librarians can lead you to their very excellent guide, library guide to avoiding fake news. It's a really good site. I bow down before what librarians are able to find. Librarians rock. There's a neuroscientist named David Eagleman, and last year he was asked by this organization that asks scientists, what's the idea that you think is most important? What scientific idea would you like to go viral? And David Eagleman said, I wish that the Umwelt was more in the public lexicon. What is the Umwelt, you might say? The Umwelt is this idea, this notion that different animals living in the same patch of the world experience utterly different realities, right? So think about it. You're walking your bloodhound in the park, okay? That bloodhound's reality is all about smell, right? Yours is not. Yet you're in the same park, the same reality, right? The bloodhound can smell things that you can't, but you're in the same park. David Eagleman thought that it would be useful if this concept that all animals share a larger reality, but our perception of that reality is radically different from each other, the Umwelt. He thought that would be a useful concept for us to use in public, right? To remind each other that we are living in the same reality, but experiencing it very differently. This reminds me a lot of the problem of fake news. He said he liked the idea because Umwelt captures the idea of limited knowledge. Your bloodhound has a limited knowledge of science. You have a limited knowledge of smell, of unobtainable information. There are things you can't know because of who you are relative to a bloodhound. And that thinking this way, we would all infuse our understanding of facts with intellectual humility, with a belief that, or a notion, or an appreciation of what we cannot see. So, and I mentioned the Umwelt in your honor, Mr. Morales, who reminds us that many, many Santa Marians are living in what you called a news desert. In other words, they are living in the same Santa Maria we are, but we are not the same reality that we are, but they are not their Umwelt is different. And so a kind of intellectual humility on my part or on your part reminds us that even all of us who share citizenship with in Santa Maria don't experience the same reality. That's it.
Thank you very much. I don't know about you, but I certainly hope I gained a lot from today. I have become a better educated person in this area of fake news, and I hope all of you have. First of all, we would like to give some thanks. First of all, to our panelists. Without you, we wouldn't have had a forum, so let's give them another thank you.